Welcome back to Not So Obvious Watches. I'm Pete McConville. One of the most common videos I'm requested to make is a state of the collection video, and I've always kind of resisted that because like a lot of newcomers into the hobby, my initial burst of action was all about madly accumulating a great pile of watches, and I'm not convinced that it was actually a collection for a long time. It was, as I said, kind of a witless accumulation as opposed to a considered collection. However, as I'm going through the process and looking at the watches that I've got and winnowing it down, there is a collection forming, and there's part of that which is absolutely baked in, which isn't going to change. So I figured I'd talk about that today. So today is my first state of the collection type video. It's not of every watch I own, but it's of a very particular part of my collection and one of my favorite parts, and that is my vintage Alpinas. Now, I fell into Alpina totally by accident. I was walking through the streets of Melbourne. I was about to go away on a trip with work. I had a pocket full of money in allowances. I saw an Alpina Star Timer Pilot for sale. I bought it, I loved it. I came home and only afterwards started researching the brand and kind of fell in love with the brand. And I fell in love with the brand really for two reasons. One is it's got this really tooly aesthetic across the brand, across all of their modern ones at least. There's this very strong tool watch kind of vibe, and that's kind of where I see myself. That's the kind of person I am. And the second thing is, again, they've deliberately, being part of the Frederick Constant group, they're really honing in on that affordable luxury kind of idea. There's a quote I heard once which said we should all aim for an aristocracy of taste and a democracy of access, and I really like that idea that that products should be trying to appeal to the best possible things that a person could want, whilst at the same time being open to access to everyone. And that's possibly one of the reasons I don't really connect with Rolex, because I kind of feel they're the other way around. It's a democracy of taste, but an aristocracy of access. And that's something that really doesn't appeal to me at all. Now, all that said, Alpina's history falls into, I'd call it, four great epochs. There's the early years, the late 1800s through to probably around about 1936, 37, during which time they were pretty much a maker of watches like everybody else. A lot of bought-in cases, a lot of bought-in movements. They would assemble them well. They were famous for being well constructed, but not particularly original, nothing particularly special about them. Then they had their glory years. They came up with the idea of the sports watch. They came up with the idea of the Alpina 4. And they really hit their strides. They exploded internationally, opened up something like 2,000 stores, did really, really well, and then got fat and lazy, which led to the lost years. Everything from probably the late 1960s, early 1970s, through to probably 2002, I think it was, when they just about died. Then you have the Renaissance years, which is after the Frederick Constant group has purchased them, and they've become modern Alpina. So they're really the what I call the four epochs of the Alpina brand. I'm going to be talking about the first three of those epochs today. So the early years, the glory years, and the lost years. So when we talk about the early years, I'll start with my oldest watch, and as you can see, I've got my collection here. So this is my oldest watch, and I'll put up better pics of this later. I've arbitrarily called this watch Baldrick because it's a kind of World War I style military case. It's a sweet little thing. I love the really florid numerals on it. It's really a watch of its time. It's a very common case shape. This kind of very small, almost cushion case was widely used across the industry. I've actually got another Mito of about the same vintage that uses the same case, and there are Rolexes even that use this case. It works absolutely fine. It drops about 2 or 3 minutes a day, but given that it's coming up on 100 years old, and I have no idea what its service history is, that's entirely acceptable. I really like it, and it does kick off my collection. I think there are some things that age hasn't done well to it. In particular, I would have loved to have seen some more contrast on the dial, but I suspect that the yellowing of the dial has kind of done away with that. But as I said, it's a really sweet little thing. It's tiny, 28 millimeters across, 30 millimeters in lug to lug. And yeah, that's it. So here's my second watch. It's Peggy. I've given each of the watches names. So there's Peggy. Mainly because they don't come with reference numbers that are particularly useful or reliable. So quite often, to just keep a track of which watch I'm talking about, you have to give it a name. Peggy because it's a square peg in an otherwise round hole, by the way. This is a watch that came in at the very end of Alpina's early years, and it's a bit of a cusp model. In Alpina's early years, it did a lot of very dress-oriented work, so this is very clearly a dress-oriented watch. But at the same time, it's starting to use the more modern movements that they were using. So it's using the Alpina 586 movement, which is something that they carried through the 50s and 60s. It's got, as I said, it's got that same dress feel. It's aging reasonably well, considering again it's probably coming up on about 80 years old. It's from, I think probably the very late 30s, more likely the early 40s, given the movement that it's got. And again, works absolutely fine. So yeah, lovely little thing. It's an odd little watch in that given the way the lug attachments run entirely from one side of the lug to the other, from one side of the watch to the other, it actually takes a very modern 22 millimeter wristband. Okay, so the next watch is Spot. Spot is named after the spots that he's on the patina that he's actually been graduating. Now here we are right on the cusp of the glory years. To the best I can figure out, this watch is like really late 40s, potentially the early 50s. Tiny little thing, 32 millimeters cross and only 39 millimeters lug to lug. So now we've well and truly introduced the Alpina sports model and the Alpina 4 concept. The Alpina 4 being a range of watches that had four key sporting style or tool style characteristics. So that was made from steel, water resistant, anti-shock and anti-magnetic properties. And all of those things are in this watch. Interestingly, it's still got a small seconds like the current NSOW sports watch, and which a lot of people are really struggling with the new NSOW. Is those small seconds. Well, if you go back in time to the origin of sports watches, small seconds were no big deal and they were quite common. And here's an interesting example. Very simple printed dial that's aging in an interesting spotty kind of way, hence the name. Overall, I love this little watch, but it is quite little. And even though I do go for a smaller watch, this one is probably on the edge of what I would normally wear. Okay, so my next watch now is James. I call this one James because he looks so good on a Bond strap. Okay, and with James, we're well and truly into the glory years of Alpina now. So this is a watch I can date to probably sometime around 1955. And the watch is really stepping up from the earlier watches. It's both a little bit bigger in 34 millimeters across, which is kind of like where I would like my watch. The previous 32, a little bit small, but 34s and above, very easy for even me to wear on a 7.5 inch wrist. And as I said, it's stepping up in other ways as well. We're moving away from the simple printed dial, and now we're getting applied indices, a little bit more interesting hands, and all in all, it's just a sort of, it's elevating the watch and modernizing a little bit. Interestingly though, still by 1955-ish, we've got the small seconds as a feature of what was meant to be a sports watch from Alpina. Now the last of my glory years watches, this is Don. Okay, Don, because he reminds me of the sort of watch I'd expect Don Draper to be wearing. Classic 1950s style by now, so we've moved into the center sections and we've also got a date. Heavily domed dial that really gives it a sense of great fun, whilst at the same time being really quite cool. And as I said, it's the sort of thing I can imagine wearing in and around an advertising executive's office in the 1950s. This watch right now is not running great. It's losing about 15 minutes a day, and the date occasionally gets stuck. So in some ways, maybe it's just like a modern shooter, but it needs a service fairly urgently. This is actually the last of the watches I added to my collection, and so yeah, it's the one that probably needs the most love at the moment. Now we've got my next one, which I call Keg Boy, for fairly obvious reasons. He tends to look like a little keg. It's a Alpina President. These are the first of my, what I call, from the lost years. So now we've moved out of the classic 1950s, late 40s, 50s and 60s glory years of Alpina, and we're now into kind of the time when they were chasing the moderns. They were chasing modern styles, chasing modern fashion, but not really staying true to who they were. One of the things you'll notice is from now on, I haven't really focused on movements and stuff. Every movement prior to now has been labelled as an Alpina movement. Even if it was built over the base of someone else's Bosch, then the movement was always labelled an Alpina movement. Everything that comes after this is not. It's a drop-in third-party movement with no modifications, no regulation, no changes at all, and even Alpina doesn't bother giving them a new Alpina registration number. Likewise, I'm pretty sure in all of the following watches, what you get are customer cases, probably brought in from a third party, and that means what you're going to see is a wide variety and kind of a lack of coherence, which Alpina itself recognizes in its history of this time. So the first one we're going to talk about is Keg Boy. Keg Boy is this one. As you can see, I think you can see why I call it a keg. Very classic 70s style, big and bulky, and actually that's not entirely true. Not a particularly big watch. It's only 36 millimeters across and 42 end to end. But with that massive brushed steel surround, it really has a lot of wrist presence that defies the size of the watch. As you can see, that sports feel is getting lost, but it is very, very 70s, and that's one of the reasons why I love this. This is a watch which screams the time from which it was made, which is something that is, for me, very attractive. And I've also got to say, it is really well executed. Even though the design elements are probably bought in from others, they seem to have bought some really nice bits and executed it really well. And I do love those massive, great chunky indices, which is again a very 70s thing, and something which is going to pop up on some of these Alpinas during this time. One of the things I should note about this watch is it comes with a hidden crown, which I absolutely despise. It's a complete pain in the ass, especially since this watch doesn't have a quick set date. So changing the date, you got to do that little shuffle, the 10 and 2 shuffle, which I hate doing. But all in all, this is a favourite watch of mine, and I do love it. Okay, so the next cab off the rank is probably my least favourite vintage Alpina. I picked this up purely because it was a vintage Alpina, and purely because it was very, very cheap. So in retrospect, standing alone as a watch, I don't like it very much, and that is Golde, my kind of cushion cased gold watch. Again, ETA 2762 inside, 38 millimeters across, 40 millimeters lug to lug, manual wind watch. So all of that on a purely spec case isn't too bad, but it's got this weird squashy bulbous cushion case. It's all sort of round and gold, and I just can't bring myself to love the shape of it. It also comes with a hidden crown, which becomes even more ridiculous in a manual wind watch. This watch can be an absolute pain to operate. We do stick with those big chunky 70s style Alpina indices, which I do love. Unfortunately, they went away from that in some of their other watches, but that's the only redeeming feature I like of this watch. And in my collection, at least, this watch represents the low point of Alpina during their lost years. Okay, however, not all was lost during the lost years. I've already spoken about Kegboy and how much I loved him. Now I've got 3 watches in a row which I really like. The first of which is Burt. Burt, named after an Australian entertainer whose nickname was Moonface. This thing with its big, stark white and utterly untouched dial just reminds me not of a moon phase, but just the whole dial is just a big full moon, and it's about as far as you can get from the kind of tooly aesthetic that I profess to love with Alpinas, but still I do love this watch. If you're gonna do dress, it's hard to go much past this. It's simple, it's plain, but it's also really elegant and really delicate and really well done. Interestingly, comes with, again, a drop-in third movement, but they picked a pretty good one for this one. It's the ETA 7001. I note that movement is still in use, and Fears actually used the latest version of that in their Brunswick watch, which is kind of cool. The only downside of this is I'm guessing it's a fairly cheap brass case that's been plated, and if you look carefully at some of the photos, you will see that some of the plating seems to be peeling. It'll be interesting to see how that evolves as it goes on. This watch is, by the way, probably around about 45 to 50 years old, so perhaps I've got another 50 years or so before that actually comes off. Okay, so the last 2 watches in my collection are probably the closest of the lost years to what I think a modern Alpina tool watch is going to look like. So they're kind of on the cusp of getting back to what you would like Alpina to be. And the first is Shirley. So this is my C-Strong Golde. It's, again, drop-in movement. This one's an ETA 2783, 35 millimeters across and 42 millimeters lug to lug. Automatic, so from that sense, a reasonably modernish size, a little bit on the small side, but easily wearable today. Making it automatic and an ETA super easy to run and to use. It's a very conventional case with strong parallels both to the earlier 4s and also looking quite modern. So it's a pretty conventional, straight down the line kind of design. A bit blingy with all that gold, probably a very 70s thing, and of course it's very cheap gold. It's not real. It's all plated or gold-like materials. Everything's still very third party, but again, everything's very well constructed. Everything's very well put in place. So it's this weird mix of conventional but super blingy, all third party and bought in, and yet at the same time really well constructed. So I do like this watch. I don't love it, I do like it, and it's got a special place in the collection. Okay, last watch in my vintage watch collection is this one, Ringo. It's another C-Strong variant, this one in steel. Internally, it's exactly the same as Golde. So ETA 2783, little bit bigger, 38 millimeters across and 42 millimeters lug to lug, which in modern sizing is really small. But again, a little bit like Kegboy earlier, my Tonneau case, so much metal really does, and it sits quite high, makes the watch, gives the watch a presence that its dimensions would belie. It's a little bit less conventional than Golde in shape. It's kind of it's more 70s, certainly almost drum cushion shaped. I really do like this. It does harken back to some of the earlier Alpina Star Timer chronograph shapes that I don't own because they're many thousands of dollars to buy. But if you want to get a sense of what they look like, you can also see some of the newer Star Timer travel and monopusher chronograph shapes. Same sort of idea. That's this same broadly shaped, so I can see a family resemblance there. Across the case, speaking of which, it's a mix of brushed and polished surfaces. The polished bits aren't holding up too well. Again, 40 plus years of beating around, polished surfaces tend to look a little bit less polished. But I do love the blue and almost mauve dial with this very subtle striping through it. Gorgeous polished indices, and the hands are still quite lovely. So overall, this is possibly, along with Kegboy, certainly my favorite from the from kind of the lost year collection. So that's it. That is my current collection of vintage Alpinas. I have not stopped. There are other watches I want. I want an early years watch where they're using a Gruen and Agler movement. So I've got an eye on one or two of those. I want a Seastrong 10, their first dive watch from the late 50s, early 60s, and the model from which their current heritage diver comes from. So there are things which I still want. There are things which I'm searching for. As I get more invested in the hobby, maybe I'll start buying some of those incredibly expensive vintage chronographs, but maybe not. Anyway, so that's my collection. I've been Pete McConville. This has been Not So Obvious Watches. If you hang on a little bit, a card will come up with my Instagram and email contact details. Feel free to contact me if you want. Please like this video. Please subscribe to the channel. That helps me out enormously. This channel is growing and I'm really happy with how it's going, and a huge thanks to everyone who supported me so far. I want to keep going, and I can really only do that with your support, and the easiest thing you can do for me is just subscribe to the channel. See you later. Bye.